Hola.
Mucho gusto.
Mr. President.
We got to do the clap first. I am absolutely confident that Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, the new administration will follow the science, will have clear recommendations, will communicate to the American people effectively. And in part, that confidence comes from the fact that Joe Biden at least, was beside me when we dealt with H1N1 at the beginning of my presidency, Ebola in my second term. And as we've seen in Europe, even the countries that have managed COVID well, even the leadership that has done the right things, you're still seeing serious issues. A pandemic is a big, difficult problem. But I think we could have been doing much better than we've been doing. And I'm confident that starting next year, starting on January 20th, we'll have a government that leads effectively on this issue. I think what we saw in this election is that America is deeply divided. And some of those divisions preceded Donald Trump. Some of them will still be here after Donald Trump. But what is certainly the case is he accelerated those divisions. He fanned the flames of division. And I know that Joe Biden is somebody who, by instinct and by character, is a unifier. And I am confident that one thing I learned as president is it matters what the president says. It matters the tone that the president sets. The President of the United States can't solve every problem, even though oftentimes people expect that he should be able to do so. But he can encourage a certain way of interacting, civility, a sense of understanding of others. I think he can set a tone internationally in terms of how do we interact with our allies, how do we approach diplomacy. And I think that you'll see in Joe Biden a return to some of the traditions that I tried to uphold when I was president. But there is no doubt that some significant damage has been done, both here in the United States and around the world. If you ignore science, if you ignore facts, then a pandemic's going to be worse. If you encourage or at least are forgiving of racist behavior, then those who have those impulses feel emboldened. If you embrace dictators on the world stage, then the commitment to democracy diminishes. And during the last 4 years, there's no doubt that there have been times where I felt frustrated, in part because I came into office in 2008, 2009, when America was also going through crisis. We had a global financial crisis. We had the war in Iraq, which had divided this country and alienated many of our allies. And for 8 years, we worked very hard to restore America's standing in the world, to rebuild the economy. By the time I left office, America was in a strong place. And to see some of that progress dissipated unnecessarily there's no doubt there's a sense of frustration there sometimes. America has always had a warring narrative, a contest of ideas between our founding documents that declares all men are created equal and believes in rule of law and freedom of speech and all these wonderful principles, and the realities of slavery and the decimation of Native American tribes and discrimination against various groups. And so on one side is the narrative that says, let's let's live up to those ideals. Let's include more people. Let's reduce the influence of race. Let's lift up people without property and workers and give them a chance. And then there have been those who said, no, we want to preserve privileges and status for a certain group of Americans and not others. And there have been times in our history, and I think my election was an example of when that narrative of inclusion was ascendant. And then there have been other times where there's been pushback against these changes. And Sarah Palin, I think, was an early sign that there was pushback against what my election represented and the coalition of people who had elected me represented. And the challenge that I saw even then and throughout my presidency was the degree to which the media, I think, was willing to entertain the notion that Sarah Palin or the Republican Party, that their criticisms or obstruction or resistance to my policies were somehow based on anything other than a desire to go back to the days when people like me weren't in the Oval Office. And I think that I've discussed this before, that we have now a multitude of media, so that many Republican voters, they don't hear anything to contradict what Donald Trump says. They don't hear anything to contradict what a Mitch McConnell says. They're alternative facts and an alternative reality that we're seeing even now when Donald Trump declares that I haven't lost the election yet, or there's been fraud and illegal votes cast, even though there's no proof of it. Nevertheless, that story still continues. And as a journalist, I'm sure you have a sense of this as not just an American phenomenon, but a global phenomenon.
I do.
Particularly because of social media and the internet. And so one of our big challenges in all our democracies is, how do we go back to the point where we can have a common baseline of facts? Because the idea is we should be able to debate ideas, we should be able to debate solutions to problems, but we should be able to agree that climate change is real. We should be able to agree on economic statistics. We should be able to agree when the votes are counted at the end of the election who's won and who's lost. And that, I think, is what you saw in Sarah Palin. It continued throughout my presidency, and in some ways has gotten worse over the last 4 years since I left office.
You described having witnessed Donald Trump's presidency, and even if Joe Biden is now president-elect, we see how divided the country is, and how outraged a part of it is. We've seen that yesterday in the streets of Washington. Do you still sustain this optimistic view today?
I do. It's always been a cautious optimism, though, in the sense that history doesn't just move forward; it moves backwards. It moves sideways. There is no doubt that humanity has made progress over the last 2,000 years. It's less violent, it's better educated, it's healthier. And yet we still have war, we still have cruelty, we still have places where people have no rights. We see it every day. And the same is true in America. America is a better place than it was 200 years ago, but there's still racism, there's still inequality. And you have to anticipate that the progress that we make is never going to be constant. There's always going to be moments where we slip. What makes me optimistic ultimately is the younger generation not just here in the United States, but around the world. As president, I made a habit of having town hall meetings with young people. And what always struck me was the degree to which they believe, much more than their parents or their grandparents, that all people are equal, that people should be judged on their character and not on the color of their skin or their religious background or whether they're men or women or their sexual orientation. They embrace the idea of a common humanity. They embrace the idea that we are stewards of this planet and that we should deal with issues like climate change. On every issue, you look at this next generation and they reflect, I think, the values that I tried to promote as president. But the challenge is that you still have older voters who resist these changes, and you also have a legacy of institutions that are, if not broken, then in disrepair, right? And so our government, the democracy of the United States has issues that makes it hard for it to respond quickly. You know, I talk about the book. We have a particular rule called the filibuster in the U.S. Senate that creates a supermajority vote requirement for anything passing. Well, you know, it's very rare, given how senators are elected, that you're going to get a supermajority on anything. And if the parties are polarized, that means you get government gridlock, people get cynical, they get discouraged. So I recognize that the path forward will be difficult. And yet that spirit, look, Joe, this election wouldn't have been close. He won by 5 million votes if we didn't have some of the unique features of the American election process. When I left office, despite all the challenges that we had faced, I was a very popular president. And you know, we had made real progress. So I don't think all that progress was completely reversed. But I do think it shows that we all have to be vigilant and constantly work to create a more compassionate, more effective, more responsive government. We can't take it for granted that democracy is always going to work because democracy is the most difficult form of government because it requires each of us as citizens to constantly be paying attention and to hold our leaders accountable and to analyze critically what's being said and what's true and what's not. And that is more difficult in this modern age than ever.
You described the gracious way President Bush and his family welcomed you and your family on your first visit to the White House. And then you write in the book, I promised myself, quote, I promised myself that when the time came, I would treat my successor the same way, end quote.
Yeah.
Did you? Was
I
it
did.
tough? I know.
It was tough, but I did. You know, I called Donald Trump that very night, late at night, to congratulate him, even though his victory over Hillary Clinton was about the same margin as Joe Biden's victory over him. I made that call. We didn't delay for weeks on end pretending that it hadn't happened. I invited him a few days later to come to the White House with his wife, Melania. I arranged for all of my agencies and teams to prepare manuals for the transition. Apparently they weren't always read. One of those manuals was a playbook on how to deal with the possibility of a pandemic. It seems that they didn't follow those guidelines that we had provided. So I actually felt that we had, I had tried to pass on the same lesson that I had learned from George W. Bush when I came in. And that the peaceful transfer of power between parties is part of what makes a democracy work. I wouldn't have imagined it 4 years ago. I'm sad to say that by the end of Donald Trump's presidency, I was not surprised that he is acting the way he's acting. But look, I think It's interesting, Michelle and I talk all the time, and I think it's reflected in the book that I tend to be a little more optimistic. Michelle tends to be a little more pessimistic about human nature and how much things change and how much things stay the same. And so we've been having these conversations over the last 4 years and certainly over the last 4 weeks. I try to remind Michelle, I said, look, when I was born, in much of the America, likely in this hotel, there were probably no African American guests. If you and I were meeting, it would be because I was carrying your bags. That's in my lifetime. And we're now sitting, and I'm the former president of the United States. And as frustrating and sometimes discouraging as the news can sometimes be, 59 years is, in the course of human history, that's a blink of an eye. The progress that represents, we've seen in other places. When I was born, Spain wasn't a democracy. When I was born, Europe was still rebuilding out of a war that had killed 60 million people. The relative to where we've been even very recently, the world is still a better place than it was when I was born. And I think that maintaining that perspective, the long view, is part of what I try to transmit in this book. I tell the story of, I give my first speech to the Muslim world in Cairo. And afterwards I go visit the pyramids. And I describe how it's sometimes useful to go to these sites of the ancient antiquity because it reminds our lives, any single person's life is a blink of the eye. But what we can each do while we're here is to move the needle in the direction of more justice, more peace, more compassion. And that's the lesson that I learned as president, I came to think of myself more as a relay runner. I received the baton from the previous runner, and then I run my race, and then I pass it on. And you do as much as you can with the time that you have. And I could say, not just here in the United States, but internationally, that the world was in a better place when I left than when I came in. And there's been attempts by the Trump administration to unwind certain things that we did, like the Paris Accords, to deal with climate change. And yet, the truth is that most countries around the world are still committed to the Paris Accords. Actually, overwhelmingly they are. And that's a structure that we can still build on, and Joe Biden can still make progress on. So I remain cautiously optimistic.
Well, there are many interesting insights about politics and technology in your book. Is there anything you wish you had done or said during your presidency to avoid social media tearing apart the fabric of modern societies the way they happen to be?
Yeah, I think you start seeing, keep in mind that this is an indication of how fast everything's moving. The iPhone doesn't even get to the market until 2010. Right? I mean, that was only 10 years ago. And so initially, I think we all felt, this is going to be all for the good. And I think where you start seeing a recognition that there's a dark side to this is that during the Arab Spring, you see people who are advocating for democracy in Tahrir Square using Facebook and Twitter to organize young people to protest against repression by the Mubarak regime. But it's then only a few years later that you see ISIS using it to mobilize terrorists. And what you become aware of is that the same connectivity that can help educate children in a remote village in Africa because they now have access to the world's library on a phone is also the same tool that can be used in Myanmar to try to engage in ethnic cleansing and oppression against the Rohingya. And what that means is, I think that all of us are going to have to find the ways of balancing and capturing the good of social media and reducing the bad. Doing that in liberal democracies is more difficult, right? Because we have traditions of freedom of expression. And my preference is not for countries to take the approach China does, where suddenly the state is determining what's allowable to be said or not. That's not something that I want in the United States. I think the question then is there a combination of regulation and corporate practices that can help to reduce some of the damage that we're seeing? And keep in mind, from a journalistic background, many of the customs of journalism, they're not laws. Choosing to have at least 2 people confirm a story before you run it, that's a tradition, right? There's norms and values. And I think one of the things that we've learned during the Trump presidency is that a lot of the things that hold a society together aren't written down in a code. They're not subject to criminal sanction. They're expectations and they're values that are transmitted and traditions that we have to rebuild and we have to teach to our children. I think one of the things that Michelle and I talk a lot about is how do we create an education system that allows our children to think critically and understand that there are objective truths out there, that the Enlightenment values of logic and reason and facts and objectivity and confirmation of hypotheses, all these things that help to build modern life. I think you and I grew up assuming that everybody would come to embrace those. What we've discovered is that we have to reinforce those traditions all the time because the older spirits of the Dark Ages are always ready to come back and reassert themselves.
Sir, you ran for the presidency on the idea of change. Do you still believe that you pushed as hard as possible, that America could not have handled more change than what you delivered?
I always have second thoughts, right? Because by nature, after you're finished, you say, man, I wish I could have gotten more done. I take the healthcare law that we passed. 23 million people have health insurance that didn't have it before. But there's still several million people in America who don't have health insurance. And so I would have preferred to have everybody get health insurance. At the end of the day, I was constrained by the number of votes that I had available to me. And one of the things about politics that you, at least in a democracy, that you're reminded of is that no matter what your aspirations are, no matter how bold your proposals are, sooner or later it becomes a math game. Do you have the votes to pass this? And you know, what I realized as I was writing the book is that my proposals were actually as bold as I would have wanted, and I just kept on pushing until at a certain point I had to make a decision. Am I going to take this half loaf or no loaf? And you know, I ended up developing a saying inside the White House, you know, with my staff when we'd be arguing about how much to compromise. At some point you'd say, is this going to be better than what we have right now? And if somebody said, yes, it's better, then I'd say, you know what, better is good. You know, you can't make the ideal the enemy of the good. And you know, I think that if I were to do it all over again, obviously there are probably some messaging mistakes that I made that I wouldn't repeat. You know, how I described our goals, how I tried to market our ideas. You know, I probably would refine and have a better sense of what dangers were out there that I had to be careful about. But in terms of the ideas themselves, I feel good about the fact that what we proposed were the right ideas for the moment, and what we got done did make things better.
Even so, you never expected the backlash which came afterwards.
You know, I always expected backlash. I think as I write, we came in differently than Franklin Delano Roosevelt when he came after Herbert Hoover. The Great Depression had been going on for 3 years. So everybody knew who was at fault. As I write, you know, we had the unfortunate situation of coming in just as things were starting to go down. And so it was harder for people, for voters to be able to distinguish, well, who's at fault for why things have gotten bad. And the fact in some ways that we had stopped the bleeding and things didn't get as bad as they did during the Great Depression, in some ways made people feel more justified in asking, well, you know, why are we spending all this money on stimulus programs? Or why did we have to bail out the banks? And because, you know, things never got so bad that people completely understood why we were taking some of the steps that we did. And so I anticipated that all the joy of my election was not going to last forever. And I did not expect Donald Trump to be elected. What I did expect, though, is that if he was elected, it'd be one term. I was right about that.
I sense there is a hidden thread in your book, which someone connects the book from beginning to end, and it's a question: why? Why try your hands at politics? Why run for the Senate? Why run for the presidency? You feel that you accomplished that to the extent you wished or expected back then?
You know, I have never believed that just by virtue of my election that we would eliminate discrimination in the United States, that black and brown children wouldn't still have more barriers to success than some of their white counterparts. But what I did believe was that the sight of somebody who looked like me occupying the highest office in the land, the leader of the free world, would, in subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways, send a message to those children of what's possible for them in their lives. And you know, what I do believe is that when my presidency was finished, and by most accounts was a successful presidency, that changed how kids thought about themselves and each other. And that was a change not just for black and brown kids, but for white kids as well, and for girls, and for people who, as I said, think of themselves as outsiders. You know, I don't write about this, but there's a famous story of a young boy visiting the Oval Office with his parents. Young African-American boy. His parents worked for me. We were doing a photo. He was 4 or 5 years old. And he had a question for me. And I said, well, what's the question? He says, you know, does your hair feel like mine? And I said, well, why don't you check? And I bent down, and he touched my head, and our photographer, Pete Souza, took a picture. And you can see the little boy touching my head and feeling it and say, oh, it does. And that ended up being, I think, one of the favorite pictures that was ever taken of me in the Oval Office. Because it signified this little boy saying, okay, this very important man, he's actually like me. And I think that in various ways ends up having overall a positive impact, not just in his life, but in the life of the country.
Mr. President, thank you very much.
Thank
for
you so
your
much.
time.
I enjoyed it.
Good luck.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you so much.
Mr. President, thank you. Thank you for your time. Good luck.
See you in Spain.